Homeschooling. Sister Kate here, and I am making this video about homeschooling. I have experience in homeschooling about 7 years. I did not homeschool my children all the way through their school careers. However, I still have something to say about that. I had shot this video once, and for whatever reason, I think it was the father, it didn't work. I had to delete it, and now I realize I hadn't put enough thought into the original anyway, so it's probably a good thing that it needed to be deleted and that I could think about this topic and then put out some information that I think will be beneficial to you. But first, the intro. Okay. First thing I want to say about homeschooling is relax. Okay? Most people who think about homeschooling, the fear that they express to me is, I can't do it. I'm not qualified to do it. I'm not going to be any good at it. And you need to just get that right out of your head, because of course you can't replace an entire school system. But what you can do is what Americans have been doing and people around the world have been doing for centuries, which is raise your children up in the way that you want them to go. You can educate your children to the extent of your knowledge, but also the biggest key for homeschooling, at least with my kids, was teaching my children how to learn and then letting them take that knowledge, and they took that and learned more than I was capable of teaching them. So that's really your number one, and you've got, 18 years to teach them how to learn. And if you give it a good college try, you're going to achieve that goal. But even if you don't, even if you're like an unschooler and you don't school your children at all, eventually they do get schooled. And the one family that I knew who did unschooling, or kind of self-teaching, they did have a very structured chore schedule, and those children were taking care of like a 7-children family, and so the boys mowed the lawn and the girls washed the dishes and they made meals, etc., etc. They weren't really given the academic background, but what they learned was hard work and how to get things finished and how to get through things. And they still, when they were put back into a school system by the system, they were behind academically. They were put in the remedial classes, but they quickly caught up and excelled because they had that work ethic. So there's really more than one way to go at the homeschooling function. And I just want you to know that you can personalize it to you. You can teach your children what you know. So if, say, you're a chemist, your children are going to be really strong on chemistry, and that's a skill that can help them. It doesn't matter. And if they decide, from chemistry they want to go into baking, they have a knowledge there and they'll be able to do it. So relax. You're going to be able to do this thing. And I will talk about how I, what curriculums I used momentarily. So one of the second important questions that people ask when they think about homeschooling is about curriculum. Curriculum is the, the framework upon which your homeschooling will be hung. And there's many, many ways to do it. The very first curriculum I ever got was called Calvert, and it is for missionary students overseas. And we were in a foreign country, Southeast Asia, and it was just approved by the military, and so they paid for it, and I ordered it for, I think, either kindergarten or first grade, and it was an entire, everything was covered. They sent the pencils, the rulers, a math book, an English, history, all of that, reading. So I ordered it, and then when it came, I used it for my son. But I didn't really like the reading books were very strange. And so I started to branch out. I did that one year, and then the next year I did, some Abeka for history and some English, And then I ordered math from like Saxon Math, and I started to pick and choose. And then like the third year, when my son was in third grade, I just said, you know what? I think all of this is way too limited to just sit there at a table and try to get an 8-year-old to do worksheets and stuff. And I really branched out. And so I wrote this stuff down. You can get some of the things off that piece of paper, but I'll read it too. These are some of the things I started using for homeschooling. McGuffey's Reader, which is fantastic, and it's from like 1890. It's great for grammar and stories and stuff. It has really good illustrations. And I bought, I think I bought all of mine used. I've gotten the whole set, which can be $150, $200 online for like $5 at a thrift store. So it's an excellent resource, and it goes from grade 1 or the primer that I showed you all the way up to the 6th reader, which is like collegiate level, probably doctoral level in the vocabulary and the concepts. National Geographic magazine, even though I don't always agree with their politics, this guy has tons of information, and there's years and years and years of it, and fantastic photos. And even if the history for the older ones is not up to date, it still has really cool things about animals, etc., etc. So we use that. We use Ranger Rick, which is very similar. It's more based in America, but it's for smaller kids. It's kind of along the same line. I used old encyclopedias that I bought at library used book sales, and they are full of information. History, again, from in the past, but from their perspective, not our perspective. Old games, which can be really fun when you're, stuck in a house for hours on end. Just all sorts of really fascinating things in these old encyclopedias. We use games from those books, but also I would let them play games, hide and seek and tag and things like that, because your kids need to move. They can't be sitting at a table there, the whole day. Then I got computer programs. I started looking, and I would buy these things at Walmart. I got one fantastic one called Zoombinis. I don't even know if it's still around, and I think it was made by a European company, but it was a logic-based game, and I loved it, and the kids loved it, and it helped them think about if A, then B, therefore C kind of things. It was really good. And then I would buy math, science, and language programs that were for their grade or, a little bit more advanced. And they really did do a good job, and they learned from those. We would go to parks, and for a while we were in Northern Virginia, excuse me, and they have an excellent park program where it's an educational experience as well as a hands-on experience, and the individual parks would give classes about things like ladybugs and butterflies and turtles. And so I would take my homeschooling kids to those classes, and then eventually they started volunteering at some of those parks. So the parks were an excellent, excellent resource. So are museums. Even local museums can have fascinating information. One that we went to in Colville, Washington State, had all the accoutrement of a local dentist/barber who used to ski across the mountain passes to cut people's hair or take care of their dental needs. So museums are just amazing sources of information. I'd let them watch movies like, not necessarily Old Yeller, that's pretty sad, but, kind of Nanook, the Wolf Dog, and old Disney movies that were more like factual based and storyline based versus fantastical, romantic, cartoon things. Movies that had any lesson for them that weren't too violent, etc. You know what I'm talking about, Veggie Tales and so on. And also we have at High Prairie an entire children's library, and I used a lot of classical children's books, including Hop on Pop and all those kind of Dr. Seuss books. Richard Scarry, excellent books on town life and interactions with your neighbors and so on. I was never into things like Sesame Street and the Purple Dinosaur. I don't even remember its name, but it's like I'm not interested in my kids learning about these fantastical things. I'm interested in them learning about scientific things and factual based things. And of course, the Bible's in there. but when we started, we weren't as strong in the Bible. So the Bible was part of the curriculum, but you know, if in retrospect, I would make it a huge part of the curriculum now. But you know, my kids are obviously grown, so it's definitely a resource that you'd want to include. And the curriculum that year, when I did all the different things and was not that specific, my 3rd grade son tested the Iowa Basic Skills Test, and he only tested 3rd grade in math, and everything else he tested above his age. He was 8th grade in like history and science, and then he was 10th and 11th grade for reading and comprehension and things like that. So, you know, the non-structural curriculum can work fantastically. Your main job is to teach them how to learn, you know, how you get bits of information and how those bits of information relate to other bits of information. And once you do that, it's almost easy. If you're going to homeschool, you definitely need to check with your state about their laws that regards whether you have to register. A lot of states will just have you make up a name like your last name and call yourself a school, but now you're registered officially. And some states require some sort of testing that you turn in at the end of the year. Some states require that you tell them what your curriculum is. You have to check for yourself, and then I do recommend that you follow those guidelines. There's no reason to cause yourself any trouble if you know, you decide you just want to be independent of all government whatever. It's probably just easier to fill the requirements. Now, when I was in states that didn't have those requirements, I would test my kids anyway at the end of the year, just to make sure that I was doing academically, you know, for them what I wanted for them, that they at least were testing in their age and grade range. And that was more about me, less about them. And usually they were testing way above. Like in the last segment when I talked about my son. When you find things, like with me, I had a shortcoming in math. I wasn't as good at math. And so I was not teaching my children up to the math that they knew. Like, they could have been doing a whole lot more. If your child is really sulky and not wanting to do what you're having them do, it's probably because you're under challenging them, not over challenging them. And that's just a little tip from experience I thought I'd give you. I use the California Achievement Test when I tested my children because you can write away for it. They send it to you. You give it to your child. You do the results. You can grade it there, and then you send the whole thing back, and they kind of keep a record of that for you in case you need it. It was simple. It was quick, and it was relatively inexpensive. I think it was $25. There's a website, used to just be an address, called Seton or Seton Hall, S-E-T-O-N. They have resources specifically for homeschooling people to test their children. So if you are going to go that route, I highly suggest them as a resource. And then the Iowa Basic Skills Test was way more in-depth. It took longer to apply the test, and it cost more, and it needed like a instructor who had a degree to give the test. But when homeschooling groups or churches in my area would offer it, I would go ahead and give it, and that's the one where I learned that my third grader was, you know, academically in some ways at high school level. So I can recommend at least the California Achievement and the Iowa Basic Skills for your kids. And I do think, you know, just kind of knowing where generally they are is good information for you as the instructor to know. This was something that my father-in-law brought up with me when I mentioned homeschooling. And my first idea to homeschool my kids came while we were stationed in California, and the school system was going to introduce teaching about the Islamic faith. And we were at Desert Storm at the time. I just thought there was something wrong about that, because I don't think they were teaching any other religion either. So why are they suddenly introducing this one to elementary school kids? Okay, just did not sit right with me. So I had a friend who was already homeschooling. She gave me lots of lowdown. When I mentioned it to my father-in-law, he said, but your kids won't get socialized. And I thought, okay. He's a smart man. Let me think about that. Socialized in a classroom is really training for the factory. And that's how school, as the way we know it, began. It became a training to where people would sit for long hours, work on a certain thing, bell rings, they move, they do whatever. So when you get out of that system, you're a perfect factory worker. Then, you know, universities were way more free-flowing, and that was where you got your higher learning. And then there was the whole apprentice idea. And there's nothing wrong with an apprentice idea, and actually it's a pretty good way to teach someone and get them experience when they're young, so that by the time they're, you know, 25, they're an expert in their field. So anyway, for our kids, what we did to socialize them was, one, they went everywhere with me when I was homeschooling. And every experience that we had, including, you know, getting a tire fixed or shopping at the store or going to the grocery store, became a homeschooling lesson. So much so that we had a joke that even roadkill could be a homeschool lesson. You know, how you figure your budget. When you shop in the store, I'd give them my children a 3x5 card with like a drawing of something on it, like apples, and a number, and I'd give it to the child who understood what the number was and say, go get apples. It eventually became to where when my kids were older and we went shopping, I'd give them a walkie-talkie and we'd stay in radio communication so they could have a little bit of independence, but I was still in contact with them. But life became their classroom, and my job was to explain to them how it was all working so that they understood it and could see where their place was in it, or how they were going to react to the world, to different situations. And the socialization also came from church bodies, from homeschool organizations, from sporting to scouting. All of the kids were in scouting programs, and Pastor and I were leaders at different times. Dance classes, foreign language classes. Our son even took swordsmanship, fencing classes. There was gymnastics, ballet. And so they would learn within the confines there of how to meet people and how to do something, you know, be in a recital, or in fencing, you know, do the competitions with each other, taekwondo. All of that fulfill the requirements without having them sitting in a classroom with, you know, a bunch of people and having to be quiet and this, that, and the other thing. Something else that that classroom does is that children with bad habits, criminal habits, bad language are in the same confined space with your child, and they can teach your child those bad habits. And that's how some schools, you know, in urban settings are just terrible, with fights breaking out and all these other things carrying over and being taught to children who may not normally get exposed to that sort of thing. And so classrooms can be bad situations as well as good situations if, you know, children are learning academics and history and the different things that they're supposed to be learning in school. So you got to think about your socialization. I do agree that there are extremes, that some homeschool families, like the Duggars, kept their children so clamped down that they've got a son who, when he gets, you know, his hormones going and everything, he has no outlet, and so he ends up, you know, touching or looking at or whatever his sister and their friends. And I can see that being an issue, and that was one reason why our homeschooling went from what it was to our son going into a small rural school, because I wanted him to be able to see other females, meet other females when he's in that formative time of his life, besides just his sister and his mother. And maybe that's wrong. I don't know. He's happily married, so I'm thinking the way I chose to do it worked for us. It's certainly a consideration, and I think it's a consideration that some homeschooling families want to overlook. Like they're their male children are just going to be submissive and obedient the whole time, without understanding that at a certain time that male child needs to assert his own independence, because he's going to become the leader of his own family, and he can't just be, you know, up under his parents for his entire life. He's got to learn and test out and flex those independent muscles. And I don't know that all homeschool families understand that, identify that, and also direct that, because the other side of the coin is one of the first homeschool families I read about. This was early, like probably late 70s maybe, or late 60s. They had a son who was interested in goats, so they let him have goats. Well, then he joins an organization based around goats, and then they let him have a business with his goats. And so he was buying and selling and breeding and showing goats when he was like 16. And by the time he was going to go to college, and he puts on his application, you know, what's his extracurriculars? Well, I'm running a goat business. Of course, the college can tell from that he knows how to manage money, that he knows how to do planning, that he has record keeping and all sorts of skills. And all of the children from that particular family were accepted into colleges pretty much as soon as they applied. So think about all of that yourself. Think about the individual that you are trying to raise up, to shape the character, and how that individual, your child, is going to fit into society at large. And that's one of the beauties and advantages of homeschooling. So the conclusion is, what are the benefits? Why bother homeschooling? I think every person has different reasons, but for our initial foray, it was dissatisfaction with the local school. The other problem I saw was that teachers were not teaching up to the abilities of my child. He was in kindergarten and could write in cursive, and she didn't want him to. She wanted him to just do the printing, which was very basic, coloring and cutting out little shapes, and he was way more advanced than that. And then it changed when we were in a foreign country to he's still in first grade. He is capable of doing more. He's supposed to be going to a school that would cost $18,000 a semester, and I was dissatisfied with what they were having him do there too, and so I homeschooled him for that. One school system was rife with head lice, and we just got tired of having to deal with it. And then our religious convictions came into it, and so we started to educate them as we saw more and more worldly things taught in the school systems, and, you know, wanted to give them more of a faith-based education. Like I said, I didn't homeschool through their whole careers. They actually, the oldest child was homeschooled 7 years, the second child was homeschooled 5 years, and then the third child was homeschooled 3 years. And if I had a chance to do it again, I might change that, I might not. It seemed to work for us. All three of our kids were valedictorians of their school. They all went on to college. 2 of them are now teachers. That could be ironic or not. And they are good teachers. Our son, when he tested an aptitude for teaching required test, he got 200 out of 200, and our middle daughter got a 196 out of 200. So especially what they told us about education, teachers in the schools where they were attending, that a lot of them were very lackadaisical, that they chose to go into teaching because they couldn't decide on anything else, and that they were very average to below average students themselves, with bad, some of the lowest SAT, ACT scores of all the professions, and lowest IQs of all the professions. And so I felt good about my very smart, very capable children going into teaching, because they would be teachers in a school system who were going to stand out and had some faith that may be able to be passed on to their students, all for the students' benefit. And then our third daughter had a double major, and right now she's not working in her major, but she is substitute teaching and having a great time of it. And the school system, once she got into their like call list, they love her. They call her and have her work as often as she will. So that's sort of our education experience condensed down. I thoroughly think homeschooling is the way to teach your children, give them your values, your information, what knowledge your family knows, what professions your family knows, all of that. And when you put them into a school, yes, there's general education. Yes, there are things they learn. My children's math skills were recognized by teachers who knew they were capable of doing math and more, and they were given that opportunity in the school. So I can't say it's all bad in a public school, but I can say that if you homeschool, it's all good, at least in my experience. And I hope this has helped you all. Bless you. Shalom.